Hello, you are very welcome along to Vanishing Foam Monthly, our new monthly women's football magazine show. You may have seen earlier this week we launched Back in the Net, which is our men's football equivalent, all about women's football in this one. So the idea behind the show is each month we want to come to you with various talking points in women's football. For episode 1 we're going to have a little look back at 2023, in particular the World Cup, and we're going to look ahead to the 2024 Olympics. We have Laura Bryan with us. Laura, I think I called you Laura Ryan last time in the build-up to the World Cup podcast, so apologies about that. All these months later, I can apologise and call you by the right name. Right, we had quite a year in women's football, a massive tournament in the middle of it with the World Cup. Looking back, look, we're going to get to everything that happened off the pitch after the World Cup, but looking back, just first off from a Canadian point of view, I remember you not being too upbeat about Canada's chances. World Cup didn't go great, managed to qualify for the Olympics. How do you feel now at the end of the year?
I feel like it's been a mixed bag. I think you're right. I was not too optimistic going into the World Cup, and I was hoping to be proved wrong. I was not proved wrong. So looking at the World Cup, I can honestly say, a disastrous performance, and I think the players would probably agree in that assessment. But if I'm looking at the year as a whole, in terms of starting out with the fight against the Federation, and then we moved into the World Cup, then the rebound that Canada showed in terms of qualifying for the Olympics. And then, the last game of the year was the big send-off for Christine Sinclair and Sophie Schmidt. So I think at least that back half of the year was ended on a high. 5 out of 6 games were won. And the only loss was a 1-0 loss to Brazil. So I think the back half of the year was good, but I think unfortunately it came as a result of a very, very poor World Cup to forget.
Yeah, well, we'll always remember that Canada game in Ireland for Kate McCabe scoring the greatest goal of all time.
Yeah, I'll remember that too. Yeah,
that was a good goal. I don't think anyone's going to question whether she meant it or not either. I think we're all just saying she meant it. But
take the credit.
looking at the World Cup, obviously there's a lot of controversy to talk about after the tournament. But we were talking about it there before we started recording. I was worried that the expansion to 32 teams, are we going to see some hammerings? Are we going to see more 13-0s? Are we going to see ridiculous scores? In fairness, most teams were competitive in most games. I think we could say I saw I was looking through the kind of debutantes in the World Cup. Zambia kind of the only real disappointment there. Everyone else put it up to the other teams they played. Like even Vietnam put it up to the USA in their opening game of the tournament. Republic of Ireland, I think we were all a bit disappointed in the end here, but fairly competitive. Philippines competitive in 2 of their games. I mean, overall, there was no one who kind of disgraced themselves in terms of the players on the pitch anyway.
No, I don't think so. I think really the only blowout game that I remember was the Netherlands in Vietnam. I think the Netherlands, that was a 7-0 win.
7-0, yeah.
So that to me stands out as the only game where I went, okay, you're a little bit outclassed. Or maybe even, was it Germany and Morocco? Germany and Morocco, I think, was a bit much. But then even still, I mean, Morocco ended up qualifying to the knockouts and Germany didn't. So I thought it was a really competitive World Cup, and I was worried we'd see a lot more blowouts, but we didn't. And I think that just goes to show how much the women's game has progressed and how much we're seeing it progress all over the world. And I think that's really exciting. I mean, I hate saying it because obviously as a Canadian fan, it wasn't fun to see Canada go out in the group stages. But when you see, those sorts of countries, Canada, Germany, Brazil, go out in the group stage, I think it just points to the evolution of the game. And it's really exciting to look at as a non-biased person. Obviously, if you're a fan of one of those teams, it stings a little bit, but it's really exciting.
Yeah, and it sets us up well for the Olympics. It sets us up well for continental tournaments coming down the line. It sets us up well for the next World Cup. We're probably going to find it to host the next World Cup in March. So we have USA and Mexico, we have Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany, and we have a bid from Brazil. It's an interesting one because obviously 2 of those bids would require multiple automatic qualifications. We're not really sure how that's going to work because we're taking the European bid. Those 3 spots will kind of have to come out of the UEFA places because I don't think any other confederation is going to be happy with that many European teams qualifying. At the same time, USA, Mexico, they would have just hosted the men's World Cup. So we're not sure if that's going to go favorably or go against them. You were hoping
Right.
the European big gets it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just as a fan, I'd like to go to Europe. I would prefer that over anything else. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think we were talking before we started recording. I think Germany and Netherlands have good chances of qualifying on their own without the host spot. And I would think Belgium has an outside chance. So when we were talking about would they take up extra spots, I don't know because Germany theoretically would be there anyway. I think Brazil would be really interesting in terms of it being the only sole country bid, obviously having it all in one country. So I think it really depends on, I guess, how FIFA organizers think having it in two countries went this time around. Did they like having it in two countries? Did they find it worked well? Did they find it didn't? Was it fine to have two host nations already qualify? I think, there's a whole bunch of behind the scenes stuff with FIFA that how FIFA is. I don't know that would ever be privy to that. But I mean, in terms of where I would like to visit, I would like to go back to Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. I think that'd be fun. So it would be really interesting to me. Obviously, being a Canadian fan, how the US and Mexico qualifying through CONCACAF or, having those host spots. I would presume CONCACAF qualification becomes easier for Canada. It would be very interesting, I think, and not to find out until next spring. I think it will be very interesting, I guess, to read the report that FIFA puts out because I know they put out that evaluation report. So it would be really interesting to see what they've assessed in terms of infrastructure, the stadiums, the ability for tourism, all that sort of stuff. So it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, it will indeed. And Germany obviously hosting the men's Euros next summer. Brazil hosted the men's World Cup in 2014 now. So the countries do have a track record. And then a little bit later in the year in France, we're going to have the Olympics. So here in Europe, the draw was made. It's Spain against Netherlands, Germany against France in the Nations League finals. France have already qualified, so it'll be the two finalists. But if France make the final, it'll be winner of the third place playoff. So Germany basically have two shots of qualifying. But in terms of the Olympics, can you just run us through who's qualified from your side of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, obviously the USA and Canada have through CONCACAF, and then Brazil and Colombia have through Copa America. So that's where it stands in terms of South America and North America. And really, I think other than France being the host, that's the only official qualifications that we have right now. So it'll be interesting for the rest of the world to finish up its qualification series and to see who will be joining them and round out the 12 teams participating in the Olympics.
This Olympics coming then, it looks like it's a real chance for women's football to build on the momentum of the World Cup because it was such a successful World Cup. Now the Olympics, everyone watches the Olympics even if they don't really like sport. So this is another chance for women's football to really grow.
Yeah, I think so. And I think too, when you look at the World Cup that France hosted in 2019, I think they did a good job of hosting that. I was able to go to one of the matches and they did a fantastic job in terms of the infrastructure and everything that was available to fans. So I would hope that there's already sort of a culture base there in terms of they've hosted a big tournament specifically for football. And then to have that translate over to the Olympics, I think that will be really fantastic. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that this is the first Olympics where the women's final will be held after the men's final, if I'm not mistaken, which would be, I think, even more incredible, to be honest. So, and I think to play at what is the final played in Parc des Princes. So that would be, I think, a really nice setting for that Olympic final. And I'm really excited because as we've talked about, the gap it's not as wide as it used to be. And so I think some of these teams, it'll be a very interesting tournament to say the least.
Probably helps as well that France will be able to contend to win it. I mean, I think it's the USA probably not as favorites as they have been in the past after the World Cup. Canada have struggled, as you know. It's kind of more open, and France are going to be competitive. So you'd imagine that'll capture the locals' imagination. But as well, there's no kind of one clear, this team's definitely going to win the World Cup, this team's definitely going to win the Olympics. Maybe that's something that we found in the world. Like I remember 2019 World Cup was kind of my first, 2015, 2019 were kind of my first adventures into women's football, I suppose. 2019 was the first time I was really getting into it. But both those World Cups, it seemed kind of inevitable the USA were going to win. Something I really liked about this past World Cup, we didn't know. We didn't know until even when it was down to the final, we didn't know who was going to win. It was very competitive. And you look at Spain ultimately won. They lost. They lost heavily to Japan in the group stages. So, like you said, the gap is closing. There's more competitive teams. USA went out in the last 16. Big teams went out in the group stages. It was the most open. It was probably one of the most open World Cups in general, men or women's, and it's that bodes well for women's football going forward because we're getting less of these kind of processions. We're seeing that in Europe as well. The qualifiers are becoming a little bit closer. Like Ireland qualified for the first ever World Cup, we ran Sweden close in 2 games that we would have been expected to lose. So we can see it that it really is a case where now I guess we're getting more competitive games rather than just these 5-0, 4-0s that no one really learns from.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest point is teams can actually take away something from this competitiveness. Even if you do lose and it's 3-0, what have you learned? What have you gained? What exposure have you gotten? And I think that's really crucial. And I laugh when I hear, I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but when I see, France as being a host nation, because obviously they didn't qualify for the 2020 Olympics. So to have them kind of have another chance at a podium, I think for them in their home nation will be huge. And I think they have a real shot, at least, of making the podium. And I mean, they were held off. I have to say this. They were held off the Olympic podium in 2012 and 2016 by Canada, both 1-0 wins for the Canucks. So it'll be very interesting, I think, for France to kind of have another shot on home soil. I think that'll be really interesting for them.
A few big European teams missing out with the likes of Sweden and Great Britain. We had this unusual scenario here in Europe. I don't know where you follow in the Nations League, but
Oh, I
basically,
followed it. Yep.
yeah, England. So just people might be wondering how Great Britain qualify when England, Wales, and Scotland are all separate football associations. England were their representative, I suppose, of the Great Britain team, and it came down to they had to beat Scotland for Great Britain to qualify. So Scotland basically had to lose to England to qualify for the Olympics to be part of the team that qualified. Ultimately, I think England won the game 6-0, and they only finished 1 goal behind the Netherlands on goal difference. And I think they would have actually gone through on goals scored if they had scored one more. I think I'm not 100% sure on what the rankings were, but it was a bit of a shambles, really. They probably should have been separated if I didn't realize it was tying into Olympic qualifiers when the draw was made. But really, having England and Scotland in the same group when they're both the same team in the Olympics was a bit of a debacle, and it's the kind of thing that it doesn't reflect well on any tournament if something can be so easily manipulated like that.
Yeah, somebody clearly didn't think that through. I mean, I have family that lives in England, but I guess if we're going heritage wise, I'm more so Scottish. And so, I've never really understood this entire Scotland and England are separate for and Wales are separate for the World Cup, but then for the Olympics, they're all Great Britain and it's, a big hurrah. And I think it's really actually to the detriment of Welsh and Scottish footballers because I don't know if I mean, I'm biased, but if I'm picking an Olympic squad, I want Erin Cuthbert on my team. And then, for her not to be there in 2020, I think it's very England based. So I think it was funny when people were saying, oh, well, Scotland should just hope to lose. Well, no, they're not going to hope to lose to England at home. I mean, that's what happened, but they're not going to play to lose on the hopes of maybe two of their players making the Olympic squad. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
It's an unusual one, and it's well, without getting into politics, we might have another Scottish referendum of sorts in the next while. We never know. Might have one here in Ireland too, but that's a podcast for another day. But looking at we were talking about qualifiers and things, the way the World Cup qualifiers went at the start of the year with the international playoffs, interconfederational playoffs. I personally was a fan of it. Now in UEFA, it was a bit needlessly complex. I'll say it that way. With two playoff winners qualifying and one going into the playoffs, it was all a bit complicated. But I have to say I like the idea of even though obviously the higher ranked teams generally qualify from the playoffs, still it gave smaller nations, if you want to call them that, lower profile nations, it gave them more competitive fixtures. It gave them at least one or two more competitive fixtures I think it helped the teams that qualified through the playoffs to have to play those extra games. And
Mhm.
it's probably no harm having that kind of mini tournament structure to just to help those lower ranked teams, because even if they don't qualify, at least they get an extra one, maybe two competitive games.
Yeah, and I mean, I know I watched quite a few of the games, and that I think it was Portugal and Cameroon, like that match where I think Portugal they scored, it was a penalty in extra time or something where they won over Cameroon, and just to give them that sort of exposure and those kinds of competitive matches going into the World Cup. I mean, obviously Cameroon has been in World Cups before. So, to have them play like World Cup quality opposition to qualify for the World Cup, to give them this sort of separate tournament, I think is fantastic. I think it's a really interesting way as well to see different matchups that we don't typically get to see. I mean, I'm no expert, but I don't know the last time I saw, Chinese Taipei play Paraguay. I don't know if that's happened before, but it happened in this, and it was a really exciting thing to see, right? So I think those interconfederation playoffs are really interesting to me. And I think it's unfortunate in the sense that I think some of the Olympic qualifiers won't necessarily be as competitive. And I'm thinking specifically, New Zealand has a very easy route. So does Japan. So does Australia. But it'll be very interesting, I think, to see what happens at the end of it all. I don't think that there's necessarily, I think whoever qualifies from Europe actually will be very interesting. I mean, I think Germany would be fun to see back at the Olympics. Obviously, they won in 2016. I think Spain is likely to give it a go. I don't know if the Netherlands will be able to qualify, but that's the thing, is it's very competitive. So we shall see.
So obviously, in terms of the World Cup, there were great moments on the pitch, but there was a lot going on off the pitch. Um, I mean, I suppose, like, look, I think everything that happened after the World Cup, it was a shame that it took away from, something about watching Spain, that the Spanish players who were playing, they were playing for themselves, they were playing for their country, they won the World Cup, and everything else that happened afterwards kind of took away from their efforts. And that in itself seems to say a lot, because it's like they've just achieved winning a World Cup, and now suddenly the narrative is about a football association defending someone who just sexually harassed a football player live on TV, and people are denying it happened. So, it's kind
Yeah.
of well, you're probably more authority to speak on this than me. What did you feel after watching all that?
I mean, obviously it's heartbreaking, I think, is the way. I think on one hand it's very heartbreaking, on the other hand it's disappointing, and I guess I'm out of hands. On the other foot, I think it's unfortunately what happened. I don't think that that's what was expected, but I think the aftermath to me is unfortunately what I expected the aftermath to be, in terms of how long it took for there to be consequences for someone's actions that were caught on camera that was broadcast around the world. So, I mean, I guess I'll go to the heartbreaking part. Is you obviously feel very much for these players. You feel very much for the fact that they just accomplished what I would presume is, the pinnacle for them in their competitive international careers. And then to have that happen and take away, unfortunately, in terms of the media and everything that came after, it takes away from you winning. You didn't just win, you won with this thing attached to you, right? And so that's obviously heartbreaking, because you don't want anyone to go through that at all, ever. And then you don't want anyone to ever go through that at that moment in your life where, you have something fantastic happening. And then it was just very disappointing how it was handled. I think, in terms of the Spanish Federation and all of the reports that we were seeing. And then what was it? There was potentially doctored photos to say this is exactly why he didn't do what he's accused of. And, all of that kind of nonsense. I think on one hand, it's very much, this is what it takes for someone to be believed. So it's very unfortunate that that's what played out. Obviously, I would hope, I always hope that that there's a silver lining, and I would hope that maybe this showed some people why women in particular don't speak up about this sort of issue, because It can be broadcast to the entire world and people still won't budge, and people will still say that you're lying, and people will still refute the facts. So I can only hope that maybe it's changed in people's minds. But I guess I will say what I did really appreciate was the way that the women's footballing community came together. Everybody was posting those letters that they were with Jenny. And I think that that was really touching to see everybody sort of come together like that. So, I mean, in terms of what I saw from the women's footballing community, it was very nice, but I would have expected that. And, it was a pleasant, but I would have hoped that would be what happened. And then, I mean, I would like to say that all is well that ends well, but obviously not in terms of the reports about coaching Morocco and things like that. So it's really unfortunate that it took away from what I think was a fantastic World Cup. And I think it's unfortunate that once again, instead of talking about how fantastic the entire tournament was, what ended up coming out of that was a man's actions. And I think that's what frustrated me, not only as a fan of the game, but I think maybe just as a woman and as a human being. That's what really frustrated me, is we weren't able to talk about how fantastic the tournament was as a whole, how fantastic it was for Australia and New Zealand, how competitive the matches were. It was Spain won, and this is what happened. And then all of the media, I mean, rightfully, coalesced on that in terms of that's something to talk about. But it does take away from what should have been a celebration of the women's game and how far it has come.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And like you said, we just had this great, amazing, best ever women's World Cup, very competitive, lots of good moments on the pitch, and then it's this very ugly aftermath. And I mean, these bizarre things coming out like comments that were made in the dressing room and things by members of the Spanish FA and stuff, and people asking Jenny Hermosa to like withdraw her statements and things like that. And like you said there, it's literally caught on camera. I mean, it's literally, we've all seen what happened there. He forcefully kissed someone who didn't want to be kissed. It seems like, and it's probably an issue bigger than football. It just seems like what has to happen to just believe someone. And just from the point of view of being a man, something I kind of feel like whenever something like this happens, whether it's an attack by a man on a woman, just even if it's something less extreme, like a comment by a man on a woman, it always seems to be a very defensive. Well, if that like, well, we can't be blamed for being men. Almost boys will be boys kind of attitude, and
Yeah.
that's an issue because it's like, okay, boys will be boys, but maybe we should teach boys to not be that kind of boys. Maybe we should teach boys to be not disrespectful boys, not sexual harassment boys. And it seems
That'd
to
be nice.
it seems to almost be this kind of, and we're probably going off football here, but something I like. We're growing up in very much a male dominated society. We're very much taught that like, okay, men are there, protect women, make the decisions, and that's something we can see when it comes to how women's football gets coverage a lot of times, where it's either completely dismissed as it's women's football, it doesn't matter, it's women doing things, that's women can't do things, or it's either, they're all great, everyone gets 10 out of 10, well done for giving you the go, very patronizing. And it's just two sides of that dismissive coin. So it nearly sums up a broader issue in the way women's sport gets covered, where a lot of the time it could just be very dismissive, very, I don't even know what the word is, but very much just dismissed as something that's not very important. And this was an issue about a woman being harassed, to put it lightly, and it's being treated as her overacting rather than the male culprit being in the wrong. And it's something I've just noticed happens when it is a lot of men are quick to jump to the fence of the man, regardless of what they have been proven to have done. And there was no doubt that this happened. I mean, we all saw it. But like, it can be very quick. I'm going to jump to this man's defense just in case. And what that seems to indicate to me is, what if it turns around on me and someone says I've done something? Because like, we all grow up in this society where we're fed certain messages, and a lot of the messages we just get as men on how to act towards women are very wrong and very unfair, and some people don't want to question those. So it seems like it seems like a broader issue in general, but to take it back to football, it seems like this isn't the first time something unfair has happened to a women's footballer. It's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I am not a player, but I would be inclined to agree with you, right? And I think unfortunately it is indicative of what tends to happen in society on a broader scale. But to your point, I think to bring it back to football and perhaps how media covers it or covers women's football in particular, I think it is very much a space that there needs to be growth. I think in particular, I look at the coverage that, well, I can speak from a Canadian perspective. We've had the coverage that happened over the World Cup. There were former players on that national team covering the World Cup. And I think that speaks volumes because you have people who know the game and care about the game and want it to grow. And I know that England did the same thing. I think they had Ellen White and Alex Scott and, these prolific scorers and players for the national team, then promoting the tournament and talking about it, and obviously having a clue, not just what women's soccer is about, but what the sport is about. Right. And so I think there is a lot of dismissiveness that tends to happen still, unfortunately, in the media, even here in Canada. I'm presuming, yes, in the UK as well, that, there is just a dismissiveness of what women's sport is and what it brings to the table, not only socially and culturally, but economically as well. When we talk about tourism and all of the money generated by large tournaments, things like that. So I think, unfortunately, it is something that still needs to grow. And I think even when you look at countries that have, are more developed in terms of their women's systems, I'm not going to count Canada because we don't have our own league yet. But when you look at the US, when you look at England, when you look at, say, Scotland, I mean, there's definitely coverage, or Germany, for example, there's coverage, and it's perhaps more fair and more knowledgeable than in other countries, but it's not necessarily at the level that I would hope it would be. And I think that there's also a reluctancy to, as well, criticize women's players for making bad decisions. Women footballers are not immune to making a bad play on the pitch. And so I think there is definitely still a difference in the way that they're treated through the media, through commentary, through reviews and write-ups, things like that. So when we talk about the women's game growing, I mean, yes, I mean, media and the discourse around women in sports is definitely something that has to be considered as the sport grows, because in order for it to grow effectively, all aspects need to be considered. And of course, that includes media.
So would it be fair to say, okay, it's great more people are talking about women's sport, but let's make it a better conversation. Let's make it a more well-rounded, fulfilling conversation that actually covers what's happening on the pitch, as well as like I commentate on games here in the League of Ireland, and I mean, I could tell you now, anytime you comment on a player making a bad decision, you will get people on social media giving out to you for being mean, and it's like I'm commentating on a football or playing a game of football. I'm not. It's not a personal piece of disrespect, and yeah, it is. It is something that just we could probably do a separate podcast on that in itself. In terms of on the pitch, then in the World Cup, what were some of your maybe starting with earlier in the tournament group stage round of 16? What were some of your favorite moments?
Ooh,
Probably not involving Canada anyway. Mine,
yeah, no,
mine.
not a lot, eh?
Yeah,
Uh, I think for me, actually, New Zealand winning their game against Norway and seeing Hannah Wilkinson score that goal, that was a fantastic moment for me. And just in terms of New Zealand football, and I mean, this is one of the first times that hasn't happened in a while. Canada and New Zealand end up playing each other a lot in the World Cup, definitely 2019, 2015. And so to see New Zealand win a match in their home country and like that was just fantastic. So that to me is definitely a moment to remember from the group stages. I'm trying to think if I can. I don't really think there is anything from Group B to me that stands out. Actually, I mean, I guess Australia beating Canada, throttling Canada for nothing. I mean, I don't like it from a Canadian perspective, but from a non-biased perspective, to see a home nation that was on the verge of not making the knockouts come in with a performance like that, missing their star striker, that is a commendable performance. They came in and they got it done. So that was a really big moment.
just to add to that one, Nigeria beating Australia in that game. Nigeria, I think
Yes.
I was talking to a journalist from Nigeria just before it. They were saying they were probably aiming to beat Ireland as their best hope of 3 points. We were aiming to beat them as our best hope of 3 points. Ultimately, that game ended 0-0, and
Mhm.
Nigeria had very good performances against Canada, Australia, got that win against Australia. And again, it's one of those results that wouldn't have happened probably 10 years ago at a Women's World Cup.
Oh, exactly. So I think when I look at those, just kind of as the host nations, them doing that. I mean, obviously New Zealand didn't make it through to the knockouts, but just have that first goal moment and a first win, and then for Australia to sort of stave off elimination, I thought that was pretty fantastic. And then as we talked about before we recorded, I mean, just to see the number of powerhouses that didn't make it through to the knockouts. So maybe not necessarily a moment in the group stage, but just kind of drawing a line between the group stage and the knockouts to see the teams that didn't make it and the caliber of teams that didn't make it. Like if you were to say to me before the World Cup in that group that had Colombia and Germany, South Korea, Morocco, if you were to tell me that it would be Colombia and Morocco that would have made it through, I don't think I would have believed you. So to have those kinds of moments kind of for the sport where you look back and go, wow, Germany's out of the groups, South Korea's out of the groups, Brazil's out of the groups, Canada's out of the groups. Like that's a huge moment in and of itself, I think, to look at where the game has grown to.
We should note as well, Portugal were the win of the post away from eliminating the USA, and
Yes.
the
Okay,
USA,
that was a great moment, but I
yeah.
didn't want to sound too Canadian and too anti-American. That was a great moment, though. Yes.
I personally enjoyed the penalty shootout with Sweden and the USA. Enjoyed the USA tweet about the penalty was saved, but VAR says it was scored. So basically in the winning penalty from Sweden, it went over the line. It had to be checked by VAR. The USA, the official Twitter account for the women's national team tweeted that it was saved, but VAR ruled it was a goal. So you could argue it wasn't saved because it was a goal. That's how I'd see it. If it's a goal, it's not saved. But we did have another great penalty shootout then. Australia, France. It was
That
just
was
one.
fantastic.
It was just one of these crazy moments of just, is this ever going to end?
Yeah, that was quite a match. I mean, obviously having a host country, everybody's behind Australia. The game I thought was a great game in terms of how it played out, but obviously it ends 0-0. Nobody's really able to capitalize on chances. And then you have it go into this PK and shootout, and it's very much, I mean, shootouts are anyone's game, really. And so to see it go back and forth for as long as it did, and then for Australia to win that on home soil, I think that was just a moment. Like that's not replicated, right? So I thought that was fantastic, to be honest. I thought that was great.
One Australian player who started their tournament a little bit later was Sam Kerr. I think
Yes.
just football in general, it was good that she was there. Obviously, as an Ireland fan, I wasn't too upset that she was missing the Ireland game. But I think there was this moment. There was this moment in the last 16 games. She was coming on as a sub. She was kind of walking down this big. I think there was like a racing track, an athletics track around the stadium, and she was walking down. The camera caught her putting on her jersey, and it was just this kind of moment of this star is entering the World Cup finally to make her appearance in her home country. It was a very special. Like she's one of those global superstars in the game, in the game that like everyone knows Sam Kerr. She's a very special player, and it would have been a real shame if she missed out. So I think everyone was very glad that she got to perform. She got to perform in her home World Cup.
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I was kind of hoping for Australia to win it after Canada obviously was unceremoniously eliminated. I thought that Australia to win on home soil would be really special, to be able to go deep enough into the tournament to give Sam Kerr the time to recover and really make an impact. And I mean, she got her home soil goal, obviously scoring the equalizer against England before they let the game get away from them a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I thought Australia performed very admirably throughout that entire tournament. And I mean, maybe the Nigeria game aside, but then they kind of use it to galvanize themselves. So I was really impressed with Australia. And so maybe that for me is not necessarily a moment, but that was just something looking at it as a fan of the game. It was really, really nice to see a home nation do so well at a World Cup.
A team that gave us a few moments was Japan as well. They kind of played this crazy all or nothing attacking football. I think in that game against Spain they conceded about 18 shots, but they still won 5-0. It was just this almost it it felt like they'd either go all the way to win, but they could also be caught out very easily. Ultimately, they were eliminated in I think the quarterfinals, but they were really on a roll, and it looked like there was no stopping them for a while. It looked like they could well just blow everyone out 3-4-0.
Yeah, Japan was an interesting team to watch. I mean, to your point, when they blew Spain out, you're kind of like, oh, okay, they've won all three group matches and they kept clean sheets. So, you're kind of sitting there going, wow, okay, Japan can really make a go of it. And, they performed well enough against Norway, I think it was, in the round of 16. And then Sweden was just a little bit better, I think, in the quarterfinals. I think that's what it came down to. So Japan was really fascinating, though, in that group stage, because to your point, they gave a fascinating performance. For them to come out and do what they did against Spain, they made a statement. And I think that was a really impressive statement for them to make.
As we said, most of the newer teams were fairly competitive. I don't know about you, I got most of my predictions wrong. I said Philippines would be one of the surprise packages. I was obviously backing Ireland to get out. I was being romantic and saying Ireland would get out of the group. I was hoping we'd score more than one goal anyway. But in fairness, there were this was a hard World Cup to predict because a lot of things you wouldn't have predicted happened. But how did you do in terms of predictions overall?
Horribly, horribly. I tend to do 2 rounds because I have or two different predictions, because I have one set where I need to be sentimental and I need to say
Yeah.
Canada's winning it all, even though that clearly was not going to happen and didn't happen. So I need to have a set of predictions where Canada wins it all, and then I need to have an actual set of predictions where I think things will actually happen. And I think I had Germany getting pretty far. And that clearly didn't happen. I had Brazil getting far, and that clearly didn't happen. So, and I mean, it almost serves me right. And I'm kind of happy that I was very optimistic about the powerhouses, or the typical powerhouses. And then, newer teams, or teams that you wouldn't necessarily have figured would get out of the groups, they performed very well and did what they needed to do to get out. So, yeah, it was not great for my predictions, but I think that's probably better for the game in general.
Yeah. I think I actually had a Germany Spain final, so I got a half right. I got one of those things right. But Laura, thanks very much for joining us on our look back at 2023. You can let us know where we can get all your stuff on your podcast/blog/Twitter account.
Yeah, no. So I am part of the trio that runs Rise Higher. So you can find us on Twitter at Rise Higher CA, or just risehigher.ca. And that's everything in terms of the Canadian national team. So yeah, you can find us there if you're curious to know more about Canada, and hopefully we have a better 2024 than we did 2023.
Hopefully, well, you have an Olympics to look forward to.
Well,
Laura,
we've got a
thanks.
gold medal to defend,
Yeah,
and this is
definitely.
the first major tournament without Christine Sinclair in 24 years. So
Definitely.
it's going to be a big year, I think.
Won't be facing Cade and McCabe, so no goals directly from corners.
Oh God, one can only hope. Seriously.
I don't think we'll see any more goals directly from corners for a while. But, Laura, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening to episode 1 of Vanishing Foam Monthly. Hoping to come to you every month in 2024. Ideally, the first Friday of each month we'll have a new episode. So let us know what you want to talk about, and let us know what your thoughts were on everything we talked about. The Women's World Cup, who were your standout players, what was your standout moment? And if you have any questions for myself or Laura or anyone else we might have on the show, get in touch with us. It's at PustPustSport on Instagram and X, and it's pustpust.sport.blog on the internet in general. That's where you can find our website. So thanks very much for tuning in. Happy New Year to you, and we hope there's a great 2024 in store for you and for women's football in general.